Okay, well, welcome to this episode of the Little Breakfast. This is the first one that we've done visually, so you can see our mug shots. I'm sorry about that. It's this kind of, we've got this kind of lockdown thing going on. I don't know if you noticed that. It seems quite a few of us have got bags under the eyes. I'm here with Dan Strange. Welcome, Dan.
Hi, Clive. Great to be with you. Great to reconnect after many years.
I know. This is sort of like one of these lockdown things, isn't it? It's like, let's connect with somebody I haven't spoken to for, how long was it? Maybe 10 years, 12 years?
10 years. And can I say, we're both looking fabulous.
We're developing into that middle-aged kind of grizzly.
Exactly. Speak for yourself. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're completely right.
Yeah, just the listeners who don't know, we both worked for this organisation called UCCF, the Christian Unions, and of course we're standard cookie cutter versions of everyone that works for UCCF, aren't we? Yeah. So,
very good.
What did you do in UCCF? Actually, I couldn't quite remember.
Yeah, so I just worked with theological students. So I was traveling up and down the country.
Of course, yeah, because you were involved with what was that publication again?
Melios.
Yeah,
the Melios, which is still going. The Gospel Coalition. It's become since the Gospel Coalition in the States took over. It's become its own. I still write for it, but it's still it's a much bigger beast now than it was then.
Yeah. You were like, I used to be editor of the Melios. It's like,
exactly.
Yeah. Well, what we do in the Little Breakfast to start off with is just talk a little bit about breakfast, funnily enough, and then we'll get into the meaty stuff of the subject, and we'll tell the listeners what that's going to be in just a moment or two. So, Dan, what does an average day breakfast look like for you?
Okay, we're linked. All the answer to all of these questions is linked to the middle-age bit. So, my average breakfast at the moment this morning was natural yogurt with some grapes in it. Now, I know, pause there, ask your other questions, and then you'll see where this is going. Okay,
right. So, and actually, there is a bit of a pattern there. A lot of our guests who are of a middle-aged stage of life have said something similar, so there's a pattern. Hopefully that is going to be doing good for the middle-aged person, because otherwise it's just a waste of time. But so in relation to other questions regarding breakfast, what would be your dream breakfast?
Cold takeaway from the night before.
Cold takeaway?
Of anything. I love it. Cold pizza, cold Indian, cold Chinese.
Yeah.
Glorious. Absolutely. It, in fact, always tastes better than the actual event itself. It's the looking forward to a takeaway is wonderful. Eating it is sometimes not so wonderful, but having the leftovers afterwards is wonderful the next day.
So I get that if you ate that later in the day, but for breakfast, that's pretty.
Oh, incredible! Like last night, one of my I didn't actually have a takeaway. I was out at an elders meeting while the rest of the family had a takeaway.
Yeah.
But this morning came down, there was a wonderful cold chicken korma, but my 21-year-old son had already devoured it. I was most upset. So that would seriously be an ideal, but I love cold takeaway. Hence the comment of the yogurt and grapes.
Out of about 12 or 13 episodes, I can't quite remember. That's definitely a first, Dan. That's definitely a first. So what would be your sort of nightmare breakfast, your worst case?
Cold takeaway, because it's the same answer. Because if I had that every day, it would be the end. I couldn't do it. So I give the same answer. The nightmare scenario would be the temptation of not having the cold takeaway, of resisting it, and I don't think I'd be able to. There you go.
Oh, all right. Well, that's certainly unique answers. So we are going to be thinking today a bit about culture and why culture matters. And before we do that, what I don't actually generally know is, we worked together in UCCF, but what was your journey from like growing up to getting involved in any kind of ministry? Like how did that work out?
Yeah, so come from a mixed race kind of background. So my dad came from Guyana in South America, came over to this country in the 60s, married my mum. So kind of have always been interested in kind of other religions. got converted through the Boys Brigade, which is a uniformed organisation that was very popular, still exists, especially in Scotland. But got converted in the local Baptist church in Southend-on-Sea in Essex. And then I've always been quite inquisitive and probably have got a bit of an academic bent. So went to study theology at Bristol Uni. And by then, I think I was really interested in the question of what's Christianity's relationship to other religions. So stayed on to do a PhD there with a PhD supervisor who was kind of the Catholic authority on that, me coming from a kind of Protestant background. And then I worked for UCCF, working just with theological students for 5 years. And then in 2005, I moved to Oak Hill College, which is a kind of a Bible college, a seminary. And I've been teaching there for 15 years in areas of cultural engagement, other religions, apologetics, those kind of mission, those kinds of areas.
Yeah.
So I was a lecturer, and I'm currently director, but next year I'll be moving on to a new ministry to start a kind of my own thing, a Centre for Culture and Religion and Mission, which will be part of an organisation called Crosslands, which I've been involved with from the beginning, which has got people like Tim Chester and others who do teaching there. So that's next year.
Okay, that sounds good. That sounds exciting. Sounds a new venture.
It is. Well, we're going to be coming up. Not quite as far as you, but we're looking at the northeast. That's where we're going to be basing ourselves. So,
are you going to base yourself there? Well, if you're that far up, you need to come up and do a big breakfast, and we can.
Yeah. Well, we're looking. I mean, it has not definite yet, but we're looking at a place that's literally 5 minutes from the Angel of the North.
Right. Okay. Where are you going to be based then? Where are you going to be living?
Well, probably around Newcastle Gateshead area. That's where we're looking at the moment. We haven't quite made a decision yet, but it's looking that way because the organisation I'm working for, Crosslands, they have a kind of a base there, although it's a kind of a virtual thing.
And where are you living at the minute?
I'm in North London, in Oak Hill.
It's quite a contrast.
Yes, I'm looking forward to it.
A cultural cross exchange.
Exactly. The softy southerner comes north. The South End boy. Just quick. I'm married to Ellie, by the way, and I've got 7 kids from 23 down to 7. The oldest one's in the Met, and the youngest one is not in the Met. He's at school.
Wow.
And then church-wise, I'm an elder at a church called East Finchley Baptist, which is a little North London Baptist church, very multicultural, and I'm one of the elders there. Yeah.
Well, you've got a busy life.
Yeah, good though.
Or a full life, shall we say. So we're going to be talking a bit about culture, and obviously that can be quite a wide thing. I just want to sort of probably caveat that to the listeners to say that probably mostly what we're going to be talking about is contemporary Western culture. So why should a Christian listening to this particularly be bothered about thinking about contemporary culture in the West? Yeah.
Well, I think the first thing to say is, from a theological point of view, is that we are cultural beings. I mean, we are created, we are finite, we are located in a particular time and a particular space. That's the point, is when we're not God in that sense. So there's always a locatedness to our very existence. Everything we do has a cultural element to it, because if culture is the fruit of what we think about the world, or making a home for ourselves, or anything like that. I mean, I've got a fairly expansive definition of what culture is. One writer says that culture is religion externalized, which I think is very, very helpful. It's our deepest commitments and desires. Culture is the fruit of that.
Yeah.
So we need to be bothered because it relates to our lives. And I think the thing I want to get across as a Christian is, if I am not forming culture under the way that the blueprints that God has set for the world, then I will be being formed. I mean, there's no other option. I'm either forming or being formed.
Yeah.
And there's lots of different ways, of different homes that people in the world want to create. And I think that's where some of the challenge comes in. So I think answering that, Clive, is sometimes I think Christians think we're acultural, that we can kind of, opt in or opt out, and it's just not an option. Everything we do, the way we put out the furniture in church, the clothes we wear, the fact that we're engaged like this it's all cultural. It's all saying something. It's all meaningful.
Yeah. Okay, that's helpful. Let's expand that just a little bit more. I've got a quote from Kevin Van Hooser, who was on a previous podcast. That was a bit of a
great
scoop. Just to advertise that to people that are
sorry, you've massively come down by getting me.
Yeah.
That's fine. Other people can talk about culture. That's fine.
Listen, you're going to attract a totally different kettle of fish listeners who are then going to go and check out Van Hooser. So there we go. So
I bet Kevin wasn't wearing a hoodie. I'll tell you that.
Well, he wasn't, and it wasn't a visual podcast, but
okay, right.
I think I needed all my faculties to concentrate on. The one advantage I had was I had studied Kevin's work for a couple of years, so that was a nice benefit of research. But anyway, so one of Kevin's quotes, which I think will help expand our conversation that we've done, is what time, the everyday, and culture have in common is that they are so familiar, so close to us, our social skin, as it were, that we have a hard time stepping back and examining them at a distance. Now, I think that's a really good quote because you've said, well, actually, we're either forming or being formed. I think we're also sort of swimming in it, aren't we? So we're in the water, but sometimes we're not quite aware of what we're actually swimming in. I think what Van Hooser's saying.
I mean, sometimes I link culture to worldview. And worldview is its own concept, but I do think culture is generated by worldview. And the point about worldview is we don't think about worldview, we think with our worldview. I always liken it to getting a new pair of glasses. When you get a new pair of glasses, for the first day or so, the only thing you can see is the frame. But after that, you see through the frame. You don't look at the frame, as it were. You see through the lens. And I think that's the whole point. The fact that we're talking about culture and worldview is quite a counterintuitive thing because it is so close to us, and it is how we make a home for ourselves. And again, most people they're just living their lives. They're producing culture. They're living culture. They're not thinking about it. I think that is important for the Christian though, because one of the verses one of the passages I found very helpful in the book of Isaiah is when Isaiah says of the person who makes an idol out of basically the fuel that they've used to cook their dinner. It says, no one stops to think, and that's the issue, isn't it? We don't stop and think about these things. Most people are just living their lives, and that's the importance, I think, from what Christians have to do, or what we should be doing is thinking ourselves, but stopping to think, helping others to stop and think about. Do you know why are you doing what you're doing, and what does that mean? And I think that's the meaningfulness of culture that's always there under the surface.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. Well, talking about a worldview is helpful, isn't it? Because I think I would say that a lot of our influence has come through worldviews which influence education, and a lot of where we're at right now is living in a sort of I need to be validated and I need to have evidence that I'm actually a useful human. And when you live in that sort of culture, then you might tend to gravitate to thinking or watching or reading stuff that's then going to validate your evidence or produce evidence more from how you're a person of importance, right? Rather than just going, I'm actually going to paint a picture because I enjoy painting. I'm going to write a song because I enjoy music. If everything we produce goes towards this worldview of having to prove oneself, then that's quite a scary existence, isn't it? In terms of actually whether we'll bother actually being those who form culture.
Yeah. And we think I often think Christians think that we're immune. It's a bit like in the book I give the example of blokes who think that they're never going to get pickpocketed because they're bum sensitive, and they'd never know they'd know if a pickpocket was going to nick their wallet. And of course, that's what happens because at the end of 1 John says, keep yourselves. He says to the Christians, keep yourselves from idols, and idols don't go around with a massive great thing on their head saying I'm an idol. It's very subtle. It's very subversive, and I think for us to look out as to we're always going to be imbibing those things. So at the moment a lot of the church is thinking about issues to do with leadership and power, and what does that mean? But that doesn't come from nowhere. That comes from other stuff that's going around in the cultural climate that then has a Christian form that we need to deal with it. It's the same with the issue of celebrity or whatever. So the ability to analyze and to try and distinguish what's going on and to disentangle what's a kind of a biblical framework as opposed to a non-biblical framework is absolutely crucial. But if we don't do the work, then I think we're quite naive as to how these things creep up on us and then consume us, as it were.
Yeah, so some people might sort of say, oh, that's all very well, guys. You're thinking a bit more academically there. You're thinking about philosophy, theology, sociology, anthropology, all the ologies. But what about, me? Somebody might say, well, I'm just I go to work, I work hard, I come home, I put on Netflix, I binge on a box set. So this links in with the book you've written, and so why would what we watch or read or play matter then? Why does it matter?
Yeah, because I think part of the problem is even within Christianity, there sometimes is this distinction on the culture definition. I've given you a very broad definition. Of course, there are different ways we use culture, and one of the ways we have used it traditionally is to talk about high culture versus low culture, where high culture is proper culture and low culture is kind of ephemeral, candy floss rubbish. Yeah. And one of the things that I think we need to look at is the fact that all culture is meaningful. Yes, there are different tastes, different rules for different cultural artifacts, but even the most popular contemporary culture can be meaningful and religious. And the fact that it's popular means that it has a massive audience that we should be analysing. So that high-low distinction is unhelpful. In fact, some of the kind of contemporary cultural studies recognises that, because if you're into kind of cultural studies, unfortunately, often it's read through a kind of quite a Marxist kind of lens. But if you can kind of get over that, it's really important in understanding, especially even from a biblical point of view, everything that human beings do is meaningful. Now, of course, there's levels of profundity or expressivity, but that's where I think arts come into their own, because the arts are, I would argue, trying to plumb those depths, ask those questions. I mean, of course, there's a lot of stuff that's ephemeral and rubbish and whatever, but a lot of it's not. And entertainment is quasi-religious. I mean, the things we want to distract ourselves with are often the themes that for worlds that we want, because we know we don't have them. So we can never escape. I mean, I always say we can never escape our humanity and who we are. And wherever we go, we're going to be asking similar questions. And I think that's true not simply of other religions, it's true of everyone in every cultural manifestation.
Okay, so picking up on that, somebody might, I think it's really helpful to define that, that we can create this kind of high and low cultural stuff. This is the stuff that's really good, but you don't want to be engaging with that stuff. So in terms of critical engagement with stuff, let's just take, like someone's watching a box set on Netflix. I think there may be underlying issues, I would suggest, as to how we engage with programs like that. And what I would want to suggest is that I think there are probably interpretive issues that we might have both biblically and culturally, so that if our hermeneutic, our type of interpretation, is purely about how does this relate to me, then I think it's really reductionary, because actually those of us who call ourselves Christians really should look at the Bible and say, what's the original context saying? How does it fit into that meta-narrative? What's going on in the text? And then how do we apply it? And I think maybe culturally, we don't do that as well. Like sometimes we can just say, well, what's this got to do with me? Rather than what's actually going on in the narrative, what's happening, what's the author's intent in this film, this program, what's the worldview? Have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, so I think, and some of this is from actually a book that Kevin Van Hooser did do on culture, where there's the world of the text. There's the thing in itself that we look at, but there's obviously a world behind the text, the author and what was going on and the reasons for that. There's also a world in front of the text, as in when I get my students to do a cultural analysis of something, if they do a film or a book, I'm not so much interested in them doing a synopsis. What I want to know is how has this what's been the reaction to this cultural product? Because often cultural products, there's a dynamic kind of cultural products are always moving. They're always changing. So if you take a film, if a film's successful, then the producer wants to read. There's a kind of a loop that goes on. You do something. What's the success or not? Or is it unsuccessful? What does that mean for the next time you do something? So there's a constant kind of movement going on, which I find is really interesting. And so, yeah, I think all of those things we need to engage with, because that's when things become cultural phenomenons and trends that we need to be understanding, I think, as Christians and how they work. Now, of course, there are lots of ethical issues that we need to engage with as well. But there's always the obvious stuff about sex and violence and all of that. But which is we need to engage and kind of how do we deal with that as Christians? I think, though, I'm also interested in stuff that we get sucked into that actually might be just as dangerous, like sentimentality. I mean, I've done a little bit of thinking about this, about how much of our culture is sentimental. And you'll understand this from a music point of view, Clive, that, sentimentality is so corrosive and sickening and unreal that needs kind of dealing with as much as some of the more obvious stuff that I think we might be more attuned to or aware of.
Yeah. So that sort of leads me on to a point. So what I'm trying to do is frame this into, like, so somebody's come home 7 o'clock at night, they're putting on Netflix, and so what is going on? Like, so how do we get the sort of balance between, right, so I could sit there and watch something on Netflix and apply these kind of interpretive principles and then be sort of siphoning off everything that's going on and then have this massive discussion afterwards, right? And almost like saying, well, I can't do that unless I kind of go through this process. Or equally, I can watch it and kind of like be entertained. And I guess what I'm trying to get at is, we can't disengage our brain from watching something. So I don't think we should just absorb stuff, which I think is the potential for many of us to do, is to just simply absorb what's going on. But I think equally, if we're overcritical on it, maybe we miss some of the flamboyance and colours and sounds and everything else that are to be enjoyed from a visual point of view. So for instance, if you go on a walk and you hear these birds singing and you're trying to analyze everything about the birds singing, there is something to say, oh, I just give thanks for that lovely sound, the lovely birds, or that lovely view. So there's visual aspects as well as kind of analyzing kind of scripts and words and meaning. I would say there's certainly and you would understand this as an artist, I don't think we've been very good, particularly, I suppose, the conservative evangelical world that I come from, and I'm very happy to be in it. The kind of the aesthetic dimension is sometimes not as strong as some of the other questions that we ask in terms of beauty. Yeah. So I think that's important that we do have an aesthetic antenna to be able to see these things and to appreciate these things. Yeah. I think it's always this constant struggle between, I think we should always be critical, but critical doesn't mean negative. It means that we've got we're engaged, not just our brains are engaged, but all of our senses are engaged. I worry when I'm watching a rom-com and I'm actually rooting for someone to be with their person, which means they're going to leave their husband or wife or whatever. And I realize that's not just an intellectual thing, that's a holistic heart thing that I need to be aware of. On the other hand, there's a common humanity that we all have that we can appreciate. And that's the problem with sentimentality sometimes. I think some of the greatest art that's made is not necessarily giving what the answer is, but it recognizing that there's a problem or there's questions, and it's discussing the questions that's as interesting. And of course, we've got answers. I do believe Christianity does have answers to give,
but exploring the questions and exploring our common humanity is endlessly fascinating. I'm just
going to have to pause the recording there because I've got a delivery at the door, and it's part of the joys of lockdown, isn't it? So let's just pause that, and we'll come back in just a second. We'll put a musical interlude on for a second. Okay, we're back in the room. It's coming up for Christmas, and deliveries come to the door, and that's real life, isn't it? So back on with stuff. So we were just thinking again a bit about culture, and what I want us to think about now is just in terms of somebody who over the years has produced art in terms of music. There can be, I suppose, a tendency to kind of think that, or other people might think you're doing that to want to be famous, or from a Christian perspective, I suppose there's been a number of times where people would say, well, that's great, but, how are you using that, to further the gospel? That somehow one has to create a justification for producing art, whether it's music or visual art or films. Have you got any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, before we came on, we talked about, the famous quotation from one Christian artist or Christian aesthetician, art needs no justification.
Yeah.
I mean, it goes back to the idea. I do think we are communicating. I mean, I think we are trying to plumb the depths of the questions of what it means to be human. And I think that I would hope the best art is trying to do that, but not in maybe any obvious way. I mean, it's interesting, and I think especially the visual medium as well, where I think words do certain things and images do certain things, and they both have their place. And sometimes words can't do what images do, and images can't do what words do. And so I don't think that in that sense art needs justification. I do think, though, that art does express what we might say we've spoken about before in terms of worldview, and that's why it's perennially interesting and engaging, and we do need to engage it and talk about it and discuss it, and because it is still offering a world to us. Which I think is important.
I think there is quite a lot of pressure on different artists who are Christians to try to produce something that people who are Christians think that is somehow acceptable. So the classic thing will be, you've got a picture and, well, does it have a cross in it? Does it have a Bible verse in it?
Yes.
Or you produce a song and, well, why doesn't that mention Jesus, or why is that not talking about the Bible and stuff? And I think it's interesting because, we can see such a breadth of things that we can talk about. When we think about the cultural mandate about just going and making and baking and shaping things in the world, and having dominion over things in a way that God has given us that to do, there is a lot of freedom to kind of write about a lot of different things. And I suppose what concerns me is that when we think about music particularly, think of the sort of 80s and 90s and early zeros, there was a lot of artists who were Christians who were writing about a whole host of things. And I suppose what concerns me is slightly the reductionary view of worship is something that's there for the church to engage with and be blessed by and encourage one another. And from an aesthetic point of view, I guess that we've tended to sort of think that the route for somebody who plays guitar in church or plays drums is to join a worship band, rather than to join a band where they're actually talking about lots of things in life, or raising questions, or being a prophetic voice in the wilderness, as it were. And I'd really want to encourage anybody watching or listening, if they are a musician, to pursue that. And thankfully, I know people certainly here in Scotland who are looking to do that and do that well. But I just think it's the slightly lonely place for such people is in the church, actually.
Yeah. And especially if you've got a preconceived notion that every single song that you produced has to have certain kind of explicit elements. I mean, I don't get me wrong. I do think if if over the lifetime of a musician and their complete kind of catalogue, it was all completely, everything they did and wrote about and interviewed was completely nihilistic. I mean, I think that is problematic because the Christian life is about hope, but also the Christian life is still about living in a fallen world, the frustrations of life, and what that. So there are parameters, which is there's a theologian, there is a worldview, but I suppose as is it Emily Dickinson said, tell it slant. I mean, there's all kinds of ways in of how we do that, and levels of expressivity and subtlety and surprise and all of those things, innovation, creativity, means that sometimes the most effective things are the things that are surprising, that things you don't expect. And that's where I think we sometimes there's I suppose a monochrome understanding, and especially when you talk about the diversity. I mean, this goes back to the music thing. I probably do believe there is kind of objectivity in terms of beauty and standards, but you can't compare. For example, that it's particular to each genre. So each genre will have its own standards and. That's where the importance of tradition comes in. In a take a film example. Well, take a musical example like the blues. That there's a standard. That there's a formula, but it's how then people stick to that, depart from that. That becomes the whole interesting thing about tradition and breaking from tradition. That's important.
And I mean, you mentioned film there. I think genre of art. Some genres lend themselves, I think, to have a better kind of conversation, putting it simply, than others. So I think film is a lot easier. I think with music, some people will say, "Oh, I never listen to the lyrics," I never bother really engaging with that. And as a songwriter, you say, "Oh, yeah, it's heartbreaking," but maybe that's a good thing if you've written a few poor ones. But I think. There is a sense in which it is easier, I think, to sort of see, okay, here is a narrative in a film, and we'll see what's going on there.
But even the most things that we might say. So, for example, I mean, this is an example I give. After the Manchester bombings, Ariana Grande goes back to the stadium and sings "Somewhere Over the Rainbow." Now, I can kind of think, that's kind of saccharine, sweet. But at the end of the day, what is that song about? It's about a hope for a different world, for a world that we don't have at the moment. It's a yearning. I mean, C.S. Lewis and others talk about this idea of Sehnsucht. It's the longing for a world that we've either never had or we think distantly. I mean, the Romantics in the 19th century, they used to build ruins. They built ruins because it was this idea of a longing for a world, a paradise lost. Yeah. And in popular form, that's what a song like Over the Rainbow is about. And of course, for 80,000 people in a stadium, there's something more going on than me singing that in my bedroom. There is it is a transcendental moment that we need to understand. That's how human beings work, and that's not just candy floss. That there's something profound going on there. Yeah, it may be completely looking for those answers in all the wrong places, and that's why the Bible does talk a lot about idolatry. But the fact that people are asking those questions is significant.
Oh, it is, and I think as well. I mean, your point you made about high and low art and sentimentality is a good one, because we are absorbing stuff, whether we realize that or not. And I'll just give you a quick example, and you can go away and do this exercise afterwards, as it were. But I just was hearing on the radio a couple of months ago a couple of songs from the movie Grease, and I stopped to listen to the lyrics. I thought, man, they are so shockingly explicit, But everyone was like, "Yeah, Grease, the musical, and yeah, it's fun." And I think it's quite a good example of, if you don't actually stop and listen to what something is saying, how you can absorb that and just go, actually, that's really not helpful, and I'm not, because with the genre, like you could have people like, in the 80s and 90s, Christians going, burn all your records, all those heavy metal things are terrible, and actually Grease at the same time is actually really derogatory towards women, when you listen to a lot of the lyrics,
Yeah. And even things that don't have a kind of I mean, I know with music and with lyrics, but even things that don't, even like, I mean, one of my friends, Ted Turnow, has wrote a great book on popular culture where he talks about inhabiting the world. But even things like dance music and things like that, there's a way that you can read them, and you can, they're still telling a story in a kind of a non-verbal way. But I think that's important. I mean, I think the thing I'm interested in is something we were talking about before, Clive, about given that you were saying that you used to write songs that actually kind of, that the words kind of meant something, I suppose. Do you think that there is still contemporary popular music that is still, I mean, do you think there's more kind of ephemeral stuff that isn't as significant and that's as popular?
Yeah, I think the problem with popular culture now, including music, is, Douglas Copeland in Generation X spoke about option paralysis. And with things like Spotify, the problem is you've got so much choice that it's hard to know what to choose. And, it's almost like, and this can sound like a middle-aged man going back to harping on the good old days, but and it probably is, but, when you queued up outside Woolworths or HMV, desperate to get that new album, and then you got it, and then you played it over and over and over again, right? And you just learned everything about every lyric, every musical notation and rhythm and what have you, and just enjoyed it. And then you get to this point where you go, there's millions of songs that you can listen to on Spotify. So what do you actually listen to? And as a result, I mean, just being quite honest, like I'm not kind of struck by new artists or bands or songs that often that I go, wow, that's amazing, and in fact, what I've now gone back to, which is probably a kind of middle-aged thing again, is bought a record player and I'm buying vinyls, and I'm putting the vinyls on and I'm listening to the whole album and enjoying actually the sound of that and the crackle of that, but also the kind of warmness of that sound, as opposed to flicking on tracks on Spotify that are not your cup of tea. But I think there are, I think it's a commercialization of music is the issue, and it's finding the people. So I know locally people who are producing music that will never be played on radio, never be heard anywhere else, but are producing really good music, and artists who are independent. And maybe we'll see a cultural shift in the same way that, you don't just go and buy your coffee at Starbucks. You look for independent speciality coffee.
And you do go back to, I remember I was listening last night driving to church thing, and on Radio 5 Live, Tony Livesey, who was one of the presenters, was interviewing someone from the Jam, and it was obvious that he's absolutely still obsessed with the Jam. There was a moment he still goes but at the time, I mean, he was in awe of speaking. I don't know who, it was the bass player. But like, it was obvious that he, there was still something very profound and significant about. Now, who knows what was going on in his life at the time, or is it the profundity of the lyrics or whatever? But certainly that, it's a kind of, it is a quasi worship worshipfulness that we just need to kind of recognize. So I do get a bit distressed when people just dismiss it, and I think that there have been analyses of popular culture where Christians are kind of wringing their hands saying, after with the Beatles, everything went downhill. And I still think, maybe, but it's still significant. It's still saying something. It's still, we still engage with it. And that's the important thing. And that's the point, because it's popular culture, it's mass culture, the opportunity to say something significant and to counter it is there's a lot of opportunity for then saying something different, a different way of viewing the world.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. And what I don't want to do is give the impression that I've got a downer on culture because we're critiquing it. As you say, it's not just about being critical, but it's about really where there's good musicians, good artists, celebrating that, and good friends of mine, Ali Gordon and Cully, are producing visual art, and I know particularly Cully here in Dundee is really connecting with a lot of artists and putting on exhibitions and engaging with people where they're at, and that's great. I think that
And the point is,
That's
the point. We need to have our critical faculties because it is powerful. Again, as I said before, if we're not forming, then we are being formed. And so we need to have, we always, as Christians, we do need to have discernment. We can never, I mean, I know, okay, I'm the word, of course we want to sometimes veg out and that, but even then, it's very easy just to let it wash over you. That's not being transformed by the renewing of our minds, I don't think.
Yeah.
So, and my kids get frustrated with me when I say, "Oh, Dad, can't you just watch the film? Do you have to kind of?" But I mean, it's always, you can still enjoy. You still enjoy God's creation. You still enjoy the solidarity that you have, even with stuff that is disturbing in a sense of seeing a very different view from the Christian point of view. But our love for others and our love for the lost means that we want to listen to, we want to hear people properly, don't we? We want to listen to where they're coming from so that we can say something. And the worst thing is just kind of caricaturing or stereotyping a view, because idolatry, theologically, an idol is a counterfeit of the truth. It's always something that has been good that's been made bad, but the essence of it will always have a kind of something good, because everything that God has created is good. Now we twist and we turn it in the most awful, sometimes perverse ways, but still there's always going to be something that we can latch onto and make a point of connection with.
Yeah, and I think also, as somebody that creates, and other people that create, the need to justify is not just I need to justify myself in terms of whether I've actually put John 3:16 in this lyric. It's almost like having to justify yourself in terms of what's the content of work that you're producing.
Yeah.
How much have you thought that through? And I think there's something like interesting about it's almost like how much you're willing, like it's something parabolic about this, right? So, like, did people really get what Jesus was saying in the parables? The people that wanted to see, the people that wanted to crack the nut and get to the fruit got to it. And so the people that really want to understand art and music need to learn the language of that. Like, so you're not going to learn Spanish and really understand it unless you really want to learn the language and get to grips with it. And there are so many nuances within that, So I don't have any pretense that people are listening might go, "Oh, I can't be bothered with all that." Well, okay, that's a fair enough position to take to one degree, because actually, do we really want to engage with art? Do we want to engage with music? Are we willing to kind of learn the nuances of that? And in regard to my own stuff that I produced, 2 albums ago, I produced an album called 3 Horizons, which on the face of it, people are like, what is it called that? What's 3 Horizons all about? Well, I didn't go around like publicizing, okay, this is the reason that I'm going at 3 Horizons, where I went. But in my own mind, it was a body of work that was actually inspired by Kevin Van Hooser's work on how we understand interpretation. And the whole album is based on hermeneutics, right? And the rhythm of hermeneutics. Now, I think this is about me and my journey and my understanding and thinking, and then producing that work. And it's up to people to ask those questions. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So actually, do you really want to engage with the work or not? And it's the same for me. If I'm listening to an album, do I want to find out about that, or do I want to find out about the visual work that person's done?
And the creative process is so important in that, because one of the things I was worried about in the plugged in book available.
Yeah, so we haven't really plugged in, but can you just hold that up a bit? Hold it up a bit longer. Okay, so
there is really nothing else like this book. Tim Keller, there you go.
Oh, well, so that's what is it actually called? You're still not holding it up long enough. There's false humility here.
Okay, there you go. But one of the things I was worried about is that a lot of it is about how we understand culture and what culture is, how culture works, how we critique it. I'm very keen, though, that instead of we're not simply consumers, we are creators, and I think what we should be doing is, creating as much. And this is where I think we have missed the trick in encouraging those in our churches who are creatives. How do you look? How do you pastor creatives? How do you look after them? How do you encourage them. And I think we've got a lot of work to do in that area, because I think but that not just professional artists, but all of us as creators. And I in some ways, I really love the fact that watching Bake Off does inspire us as a family to try and let's do some baking, let's do some cooking. We need to be doing that. Let's make music, however badly it is, but instead of just letting it wash over us as consumers, let's go and do our own mini version of subduing and fulfilling, which I think is really important as well.
Yeah, that's a really important point you've just made, and we'll move towards a close in just a moment. I think that's a good takeaway for those people listening and saying, "Oh, it's a bit theoretical for me," just talking about culture and art and music and what have you. Unpack that a bit more for us, Dan, in terms of the subduing and the making. What does that look like, or what could that look like for people listening or in churches and what have you?
Well, I think it is recognizing the wonder of creation and the diversity of creation and the different skills that God's given people to enjoy His creation. That as Christians, it should be that we're the most creative people. We're the people who, because we know we don't have to prove ourselves, because we know that the world is under curse, but it's not a scary place because we know Jesus is Lord. We should be taking every day and saying, "Wow, God, what have you got for me today? What's the adventure today?" It's in some senses, we should be very risk-taking people. I mean, we live in a very risk-averse society. Christians should be taking godly risks in terms of what we do, what we create. There's a people often think Christianity is so stifling, but it's so freeing to be who we were created to be.
Yeah.
And that means, I think, in terms of art and being able to apply, because I believe the gospel, we need to apply the gospel to everything that we do in our lives. There's always a gospel significance. It's not just I do my stuff on a Sunday, I do my stuff on a Wednesday for church, and the rest is normal life. The gospel applies to all of life. We're to take every thought captive for Christ. And that's how we do disciple making. And that, I think, that then is naturally evangelistic and witnessing, because people will say, "Wow, there is something different about that person or that Christian community." So the idea to be imaginative and innovative, I mean, I think we've got a long way to go there in how do we develop a Christian imagination, which of course historically Christians have done, and it's been wonderful, but we don't need to be scared of doing that. And when we do those things as disciples, then we will be making disciples of others, because people will realize, wow, the gospel does apply to everything that I do, and Jesus is Lord, and that's the joy of living, as it were.
Now that's really interesting, because I think where we're at right now, that imagination that we need is not purely for those who would call themselves artists. I think it's for that whole dominion, isn't it? So if we think about, we're in a pandemic right now, what is church going to look like in the next year or two? What are we actually going to do now at this kind of crossroads in history where we've been out of the building, we're going to go back into the building. Imagination, creativity in terms of leadership structures, how we do things, it's going to be so important. And actually, I think it's such an exciting time. It can seem scary, but it's such an exciting time to think of, well, how can we under God be imaginative and be creative in terms of what it looks like?
And I think, in some ways it's very hard, because the arts generally, it's a massive overgeneralization, but obviously the arts have been a sector of society that's been probably most decimated by COVID. Everyone sees that. I would hope, though, that the message is getting through that bare existence is not great life, as in there is a quality of life that needs artistic endeavor, needs churches open to be able to discuss and worship God, but also that we have theatres open, that we have concert venues open. I think we're much poorer for it, But it's this view that if you do think, as Lennon said, above us is only sky, then you'll hold bare existence you'll hold out everything for that. Whereas I'm very much on the quality of life means that, sometimes for quality of life, we do need these communal spaces. We do need the ability to make music and to go to plays and to watch films and for me as a Christian to be able to be with God's people and worship Him. That's why I've been created. Yeah. So it does throw up those kinds of questions. And now we don't. I mean, I know there was a thing on Strictly Come Dancing at the weekend about Andrew Lloyd Webber, and it is isn't it terrible that all of our musical venues are true? But there's that it is true. We're poorer for it, for that richness of life, which I think points to who we are as human beings, and there are deep questions there about creativity and what we've been made for, which I hope the pandemic has kind of stirred up a little bit. Yeah.
So where do you think we might be in a couple of years from now in the light of what you said? I mean, I'm not holding you to this, but what would you like to see things looking like in relation to what you just said over the next couple of years?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would hope that there is the opportunity for innovation. I mean, the role of technology, I think, is it can be a blessing, it can be a curse. I personally think the way that we've been created, that physical bodily presence is really important, that we are meeting now, but we are meeting virtually. We're not meeting in person. I do think that makes a difference in how we've been made. So the importance of being together physically, I think, is important. And I would hope we would realize that. And, the sooner we can try and get back to that kind of existence, then the better. But yeah, I think we do need to be innovative and creative in terms of how we encourage others, especially. I mean, I do have a real passion for trying to say, how do we support those who want to be creative, who do want to be involved in the arts? How can we nurture that? I mean, I know the storytelling thing is sometimes a bit overplayed because everything's story this, story that. But I think as creatures, we do think in terms of narrative, and the stories that we tell, and the more imaginative we are, it does capture people's hearts and minds. And I think Christians need to be doing that because we do have. I mean, I still do believe. We do have the most amazing story, of which all the other stories are kind of copies, and sometimes not great copies. So I think to be able to the opportunity then to introduce people to the person of Christ is an amazing opportunity and privilege, and as Christians we should be wanting to do that. So I would hope that all of this pandemic will do a bit of a reset for us to be able to think, okay, how do we do this innovatively, creatively, and faithfully?
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's good. And there may be people that have questions or comments about this podcast. And if you do, you can check us out on The Little Breakfast on Facebook. We've got a page there. We've also got a Twitter page. And Dan, I think, is on Facebook and on Twitter as well. What's your handle? It sounds very sort of 1414 for a copy.
At Dr. Dan Strange. I don't know. I don't. Something like that.
He's into the promotion trail. Not
exactly. No, the one thing I would promote is not only this book I did on Plugged In, but I'm currently next summer. There's going to be another book on what I think from a Christian point of view are these perennial themes that human beings always ask. So kind of what we might call magnetic points. The same. Whether it's another religion, whether it's a songwriter, whoever it is, we always ask the same kinds of questions. And this book's trying to understand what those questions are, and then how does Jesus both confront and connect with those? So look out for that, because I think there's some real traction that we can gain.
So that's a work in progress, is it? Yeah.
Well, it's basically written, and now it will be published by the Good Book Company next late summer. So yeah.
And the Plugged In book is on the Good Book Company, available from where can people get hold of it?
And anywhere, Good Book Company, Amazon, and Plugged In, connecting your faith with what you watch, read, and play.
Okay.
And for anyone interested in, I suppose, a bit more of a deeper read, there's Themelios, which is the journal that we spoke about by the Gospel Coalition.
Yeah.
I do I'm a consulting editor. I do a contributing editor. I do an editorial. So I've done lots of editorials on this issue of sentimentality. There was one on the film on Risk with Free Solo and Alex Honnold, the climber who climbed El Capitan.
Oh yeah.
I always kind of take a theme like that. And the last one was on this phenomena about why you shouldn't say in an office it's quiet today because that makes the phones ring. So it's like on the quiet. So if you're interested in that kind of stuff, then go to Themelios and you'll find my editorials there.
And can people, is that online, Dan?
Yeah, it's all online. Yeah, it's all free.
That's great. I used to remember all the yellow and black books that used to sort of pile up and in the house.
They've all been digitized now. They've all been digitized, but So Themelios is the journal. Thanks.
Okay. Well, thanks so much for taking the time today, and all the best with the move to the northeast. If you want to perfect the accent, I heard that the word conjunctivitis is a good one to practice on. So it's basically conjunctivitis. That's a good one to get your northeast accent.
I'll practice that in the privacy of my own bedroom. Thank you.
But you've got to learn more words than that, obviously.
Thank you. Yeah, that's not going to get me
people
very
think you're infectious for the wrong reasons. Yeah. All right. Thanks for joining us, Dan.
Thanks, Clive. Thank you.